Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me. As I suspect you've just heard, I teach information systems at GW in Washington, and most of my research has been on online education over the last few years, and in particular, the way in which technology has provided both threats and opportunities in that particular area. As you might expect, I have followed the advent of MOOCs, massive open online courses, with enthusiasm and a great deal of interest. And I think what I'd like to talk to you today about deals with the threats and opportunities that the technology is going to provide, but set against a background of changing expectations in the desires and wants and needs of the students. So thank you for having me. And I now would like to start by showing you a picture of what we've come to think of as a virtual classroom. It can be synchronous or asynchronous. It can be, it can have a great deal of help or very little help. It probably is going to use a range of technologies like a whiteboard so that the professor can make points in a visual manner. It's probably going to allow some form of document sharing. It's probably going to allow students to post to bulletin boards, that kind of thing. It's also, as these things have become a little bit more sophisticated than perhaps the technology that enables them, it usually has a backup so that you can dial in using your phone or some other device if the internet connection fails. So they've become, I think we can think about the virtual classroom as becoming a substitute in many ways of the classroom. It's tried to mimic the kinds of things that we do in the regular classroom. So it looks like a real classroom if you want to think of it that way. What I would then like to add to that is a whole range of technologies that are going, and I think we can see being incorporated in the virtual classroom. And I've put up some sort of pictures there of these technologies and the way I see them enhancing or overcoming difficulties with what we're seeing in the classroom. In the top right, it's intended to represent gaming on the internet by students and so by people. And I suspect that what we're finding is that, first of all, our students probably play these sorts of games and are used to interacting with um, other people in a virtual environment. The second thing that comes from the games is that the technology that has been developed for gaming is finding its way into the learning management systems. The idea of an avatar or some sort of representation, I think you can see that as um, part of the environment in which the students are likely to be involved in. I'll come back to games in a minute from a different point of view, but moving just on to the next point there, the next one is intended to indicate the ubiquitous high-speed communications. Each year, it seems more and more people are connected at high speed. Um, each country, each city, and although the gaming technology requires high-speed broadband connection, more and more people now have that available to them. Changing tack for a moment, one of the ways in which one of the things we've had to overcome a lot in online education is a suspicion that the people taking the courses are not really there, that somebody else is doing it for them. So how do we know that the student who's submitting the work, the student who's participating, etc., is in fact the student that's enrolled in our course? And I've put a picture up there of a retina scan. The idea being, of course, that the cameras and so forth that are sophisticated enough now to look at our eyes will, in fact, if we need to, be able to determine that it is, in fact, me or the student. Another example of the advances of software in this area is that software will today determine whether it is me or somebody else typing, hitting the keys on a keyboard. So what we have there is a range of technologies that are, in a sense, providing us with a background from which to develop these virtual classrooms. They're providing the network on which we rely, and maybe to some extent, as these kind of technologies develop, we'll have ways in which the people participating in the course we can be assured that they are the people who are enrolled in it. Coming across the bottom, I've shown you a basic sort of learning management system. It looks kind of like a dashboard. The system that I'm using here at Adobe Connect, the gaming system, has different parts to the screen. We can interact with it in different ways. And in some ways, I guess that's a little bit like students might interact in a classroom by themselves. They can find out information, they can listen to the professor, they can quickly ask their neighbor for feedback on something that they missed or the importance of something. If necessary, of course, today they can pull out their phone or their tablet and look up something that might be relevant to it. And then finally, the idea of document sharing and being able to promote students working on materials together is finding its way into these classrooms as well. I talked about games before, and one of the things that I've been experimenting with over the last 2 or 3 years is putting some of the games we use in the online in the face-to-face classroom into the online classroom. There are a number of games, for example, that deal with SAP products. We've figured out a way to make these work in the online environment. It does require some degree of synchronicity. In other words, the people have to be there at the same time, but not in the same place, of course. And what's attractive about that is it's helping overcome another criticism of online classes, and that is the lack of student engagement. Often students feel that they're kind of dumped into the learning environment. Nobody pays them much attention. They post things which they don't know whether people read, etc., and they lose interest. The use of games not only is a good teaching tool for teaching things like business processes and so forth, but it also provides the students with a feeling that they're involved in the class. And certainly where I'm teaching now at George Washington and recent positions I've held, we've been very concerned about trying to find ways to get the students engaged in the classroom. I'll come back to that theme a little bit later, but that's kind of the focus of what I was trying to say in terms of games. Not only are we getting the technology, not only are we getting the experience, but the games in themselves may provide us with a way in which we can better have the students engaged in the programs. I said to you at the beginning that the environment is changing somewhat here. And I just want to spend a few moments talking about the background. to that. I think that it's probably fairly well recognized that MBA type enrollments are in decline, at least in the United States, and particularly so in what we might term the kind of lesser schools. I'm not talking about Harvard and Stanford here, but I'm talking about a range of universities that offer a MBA that perhaps is more open to challenge from other forms of education than might otherwise be the case. So in one sense, at one level here, we're seeing declining enrollments, and this is a particular issue for the universities because for a long time, the MBAs have been a cash cow. The money that the graduate programs brought in terms of student tuition fees and so forth, went a long way to paying academic salaries. As we see again in the United States, but not only, as we see the money for education being screwed down and the duplicate or the parallel effect of falling graduate enrollments, that's putting a lot of pressure on the universities to find ways to deal with that. Also, I think we're seeing a rise in what we might loosely term executive education. Um, these are either small certificate type courses or perhaps just a 2 to 4 hour or perhaps a weekend or perhaps several weekends sessions where the education offered is pointed at a particular group, a particular need, or a particular skill. And so that's another challenge, I think, for the current environment and people who are wanting to take advantage of what's on offer to do things like get a promotion or get a slightly different job or a new job, are looking to those kind of executive education. And I'm involved in one myself. But that I would think that has to be, in the medium term, another challenge to the way in which we do things. And we're starting to see a bunch of potential revenue models emerge. The example that I have, or some of the examples that I have there on the screen for you, if edX, the MOOC, the Harvard-based MOOC provider, charges $100 for a certificate, well, they've so far issued 100,000 certificates. That's $10 million. That's going a considerable way to offset some of the costs associated with the course. Corporate sponsorship, the idea of a company or a business. AT&T recently signed, as some of you would know, recently signed a deal with Georgia Tech to provide an entire computer science degree online for AT&T people. And it may well be that other corporations are willing to sponsor courses, not only for their own employees, but the idea of having their name out there and so forth. Another potential revenue model is employer access to students. Let's provide our potential hirers with the names of the students who've done well in the courses, that kind of thing. Advertising, licensing, tax credits, all of those types of issues may come into play here. Credit transfers. The institution that I do some, not GW, but the Executive Education Institute, has a long-term goal of providing education to people from around the world, which then universities might recognize as perhaps the introduction year or the first year or the first semester of an MBA, and that would, or a master's degree, and that would channel in extra enrollments into that group. In fact, in a sort of related development there, MIT last year, I think, announced that their logistics master's program is now available online for the first year, and if you take it online pretty much for free, you will get an advantage, if you like, or and do well in it, that will increase your chances of being able to go to MIT full-time the following year and finish the degree. And finally, there are facilitation sessions, the possibility that somebody might provide sessions where students can come together in a face-to-face environment. So I think that what we're seeing here is, while none of these things is on its own big enough to drive change, while none of these things is going to happen overnight, the fact that we have all of these things happening together, the technology, the falling enrollments, the pressures, the different revenue models, the executive education, the vast array of courses that are available this way, all putting pressure on academics and universities. And I suspect that over the next year or two, or maybe up to 5, or perhaps even 10, we're going to see movement in this direction. So with that as kind of background, I just wanted to add to this by sharing with you a little experiment we did here at George Washington over the last semester. Just bear with me for a moment while I give you a little background to it. It was a graduate class. In fact, it was a final year graduate class. And we had the students do a major project, which was really the whole purpose of the course, was to take them through the development of a system from its conception through to a working prototype. I encouraged the students, in fact, I didn't encourage them, I told them they had to use a virtual environment for their team meetings. I left it open to them as to which environment they wanted to use. I suggested WebEx, which as GW students they had access to. Google Hangouts, they also had access to that. Slack was another one that some of the students used. And these were all communications tools, I suppose, which were intended to facilitate their working together in some form of learning environment. It's not exactly the same as a virtual classroom, but on the other hand, it almost is. The objective of this course was really not to produce a polished, magnificent system at the end. The objective of the class was to see how all of the stuff that they'd learned over the previous 2 years in their master's program fitted together, and what sort of difficulties they anticipated and what sort of difficulties they then had to overcome in actually working together in this particular team. And just to underline this, I told each team that they had to invite me to an occasional meeting that was online, and I would sit in and listen to what they were discussing and how they went about it and so forth. So that's the basis of this particular experiment. There was a series of groups doing a major project, meeting virtually, sharing work, and they were using those communication tools, including Skype, and then they were using tools like Adobe Collaborate and Google Docs to share their work. So what did we find? Well, I think that I just need to, again, a little more background here. And you see it reflected in this slide. The students, by their very nature, were familiar with the technologies. They hadn't used them for this purpose before, but they nearly all had used Skype or something similar. They were experienced in using those technologies. They were confident in using those technologies. And I think importantly, they did have a good internet connection where they lived. They were in dorms or apartments or wherever, but they were in a major city. They were in Washington with fairly good internet connections. So what we saw from that, and again, it's probably not surprising, but as far as I know, this is kind of a first. What did they think about the learning environment? Now, remember that the learning environment here was not so much as learning from the professor, but learning from each other. The problems that they were encountering and the difficulties that they struck in overcoming those problems. Was it a good learning environment for that? And 90% strongly agreed that it was a good learning environment. Did it contribute to their learning? Again, high percentage, 93% agreed with that. And should it be part of it? So what's important here, I think, in recognizing that the learning environment is indeed a good place the online environment is a good place for a learning environment to flourish. I think we do have to remember that the students were familiar and experienced and confident as well. So from an education perspective, if we're going to offer this, we do need to make sure that those background criteria are in place, or the students will get left behind, disillusioned, not engaged, etc. So the takeaway from this, I think, from this little study that we did here, and again, I'm stressing those points for those that are experienced and confident in using the online tools, good bandwidth, reliable connections. It was a very acceptable and perhaps even a preferred alternative to the face-to-face environment. The reason I can say that bit was that when we scheduled the course, I had some meetings scheduled as face-to-face and some meetings scheduled as virtual. As the course went on, I offered them the opportunity to pass on the face-to-face meetings and have a virtual meetings instead. And most times, most groups of students did that. Now, there would be other reasons as to why this was a good thing. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's raining, sometimes it's snowing. There's a commute distance. Many of the students worked, had families. This was a very convenient way of coming together. And further study will examine perhaps some of those things and their influence on this as well, but we haven't done that yet. So for those students who are able to work in this way, it seems to me that this is a very acceptable alternative. The challenge, of course, is to be able to create that environment while we also do the two important things of maintaining academic integrity and student engagement. The academic integrity here, of course, was that they were learning something, that they were learning it themselves. They weren't, on the back of somebody else. They were submitting their own work to their peers. They were revising that work. They were coming together with a group solution to a problem that they were all happy with, and so forth. And again, the very nature of this project meant that they were engaged. There was a peer review process associated with a major project. They had to comment against quite a lengthy list of criteria, how each team member had performed. There was little room because the project was a fairly large one and the teams were, I think, 5 to a 10. So there was not a lot of room for free riders. So the students had to be involved. So in a sense, the project itself contributed to the student engagement. If that is not the case, we will need to find other ways for that student engagement to be part of the course. Otherwise, we'll end up looking like this poor depressed lady on the screen. So the point that I was trying to make here is that the environment seems to have a lot going for it, but we still have challenges around the academic integrity and the student engagement. So what I would like to conclude by talking about here is something of a new model, which I've been working on for a while, that I think is likely to affect graduate offerings and the take-up of those offerings. I think it's important, before I get into the model, I am talking here about graduate education. I think that the studies that I have done around the graduates have the following characteristics, if you like, of the individual students. Because they're graduate students, they've already addressed things like time management. They know where to get the resources for their work that they need to do. They know how to do some research to put their work together. They have writing skills. They have an ability to communicate with their other students. They know probably already how to work in teams. So with that as a background, this particular group of students, and indeed one of the initial findings from the MOOC offerings was the students who were most enthusiastic about the MOOCs were already graduates. They weren't being overwhelmed with issues such as time management and so forth, or not being able to keep up. They already had developed those skills. And that's why I've focused this talk in particular around the graduate programs. But what I see here is perhaps a role in the middle from a student now with this bewildering array of opportunities here, right? There's MOOCs, there's dozens, probably hundreds of providers with useful material out there, from YouTube videos all the way through a full computer science degree, such as the one I mentioned before that AT&T is sponsoring at Georgia Tech. Alongside that, there's executive training, there's certificates and so forth. So what I see here is possibly a role for some form of licensed education provider, or maybe a counselor who these folk can turn to. It may indeed be a university or a portion of a university, but clearly that case they would be pushing their own products. But there'll be some sort of middleman here providing advice on careers and courses, and maybe even providing certificates if that is what the students want. Perhaps the middleman will play a role in proctoring exams or ensuring that the right person is getting the certificate, all those kinds of things. But I think that given the pressures that we talked about earlier in the background for the students, the pressures on the universities in terms of money, the pressures on the students in terms of money, the need for wanting access to education, which might not necessarily be a 2-year or longer degree, but something more specific, I can see something along these lines emerging. So to finish, what I guess my point that I would like to make here is that, first of all, the technology is not going to go away. It's only going to get better and more useful for the sorts of things we want to see. We're going to see things like developments in gaming. We're going to see things like more ubiquitous high-speed broadband. We're going to see developments in technologies that will enable us to address both the academic dishonesty issues and the student engagement. Whether we take advantage of these, of course, is a different matter, but they are there. We're going to, I think, see cost and employment pressures continuing to increase. I mentioned before, we have a vast array of people wanting to provide these opportunities, and we have the resources, the technological and the professional are ready to do that. Make no mistake, there will be missteps and failures and disillusionment and sorrow and front page headlines about failures. But I do see a a brighter future than that. I think all of these things will happen as we go through the process. And I think in the end too, I see a changing role for providers. They will have to decide as to how much they want to be part of this disruptive technology, or embrace it, or pretend it doesn't exist. For Latin America, I think that it's well placed. In many cities, there's a very well-educated population, technologically savvy, like the students who are used to using the communication tools and so forth, and like you watching and participating in this online conference. It's in the time zone next to or parallel to the by far the biggest economy on Earth, and looks like staying that way for some considerable time. As I understand it, and I guess stand to be corrected here, I guess, but as I understand it, broadband and the technology that's necessary to provide the platform here is expanding in Latin America, and to the extent where it's widely available. So I see here an opportunity really for Latin American providers to extend their education offerings in the field of graduate education. Now, by doing that and by extending those, that is going to bring pressure to bear on what we have provided to this point. So that's my thoughts. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me. And I'll be happy to entertain questions.